Napoleon Bonaparte was, by almost any measure, one of the most gifted human beings who ever lived. Military strategist, legal architect, administrative genius, a man who rose from obscure poverty to rule most of Europe before he was 40. And he destroyed everything he built, not because he was unlucky, not because he was betrayed, because the same psychological architecture that made him extraordinary made him unable to stop. Today, we're going inside the mind of a man who was simultaneously the most competent and the most self-destructive leader in modern history. Here's what makes Napoleon psychologically different from most tyrants. He wasn't delusional. His achievements were real. His talent was genuine. The problem wasn't that he believed things that weren't true. The problem was that he couldn't accept the things that were. The limits, the losses, the moments when the world refused to cooperate with his vision of it. Psychologists studying Napoleon's life identify a specific cluster: narcissistic personality structure built on top of genuine competence, compensation patterns rooted in early shame, and a drive for dominance so total it eventually turned every achievement into a launchpad for the next conquest. He didn't want to win, he needed to. And that need had no ceiling. Start here because it explains everything that follows. Napoleon was born in Corsica in 1769, the year France acquired the island. He grew up French but was never French. At school in mainland France, he was mocked for his accent, his poverty, his outsider status. Psychologists call the response to this kind of early shame compensatory narcissism, a grandiose self-construct built not from natural confidence, but from the need to obliterate humiliation. This is distinct from Hitler's grandiosity without foundation. Napoleon had the talent to back it up. But the engine underneath wasn't confidence. It was rage, the need to prove to everyone who ever dismissed him, to every institution that ever underestimated him, that he was not just equal, that he was superior. This is why Napoleon could never simply win. Every victory had to be total. Every opponent had to be crushed. Every institution that survived him intact felt like an unfinished sentence. The humiliated child from Corsica never left the room. He just got an army. Here's the mechanism that turned genius into tyranny. Napoleon's need for control was not strategic. It was psychological. At his peak, he was personally overseeing military campaigns, legal codes, architectural projects, diplomatic negotiations, and the education curriculum of French schools, simultaneously. Historians marvel at this as evidence of his extraordinary capacity. Psychologists see something else. An inability to delegate is not a superpower. It is an anxiety response. The person who cannot trust others to execute without them is not more capable than everyone else. They are more afraid of what happens when they're not watching. Napoleon's letters reveal a man in constant motion, never still, never satisfied, never able to rest in what he had built. Every solution created a new problem that only he could solve. Psychologists call this hypercontrol, the need to manage every variable to prevent an outcome that feels existentially threatening. For Napoleon, that outcome was irrelevance. To stop controlling was to stop existing. Here's the concept that explains his collapse. In 2007, British politician and neuroscientist David Owen introduced the term Hubris Syndrome to describe a specific pattern of psychological deterioration in people who hold power for extended periods. The symptoms map onto Napoleon with disturbing precision: a messianic belief in one's own historical mission, contempt for the judgment of others, restlessness and recklessness, an identification of personal interests with national interests so complete that criticism of policy becomes personal attack, and, crucially, a loss of contact with reality that develops gradually, imperceptibly, as the feedback loops that once corrected behavior are eliminated one by one. Napoleon dismissed his generals when they disagreed, replaced advisors who challenged him, surrounded himself with people whose primary qualification was loyalty. By 1812, when he invaded Russia with 500,000 men against every strategic calculation available to him, the feedback system was gone. Not because he had become stupid, because he had become untouchable. And untouchable people cannot learn. Here's the psychological trap at the core of his destruction. Napoleon's identity was entirely fused with achievement, not with France, not with his family, not with any value or relationship that existed independently of his success, with achievement itself. Psychologists call this contingent self-worth, a sense of personal value that depends entirely on external performance. When you win, you exist. When you stop winning, you disappear. This is why Napoleon could not make peace. Not because peace was unavailable. It was offered multiple times. After Austerlitz, after Wagram, after the initial Russian campaign showed its catastrophic cost. He refused, because peace meant stopping, and stopping meant confronting what was underneath the achievement. The boy from Corsica, the outsider, the one who was never quite enough. Every treaty would have required him to sit still, and in stillness, the thing he'd been running from his entire life would catch up. So he kept moving, until there was nowhere left to go. Here's the final mechanism, and the most tragic. Genuine genius creates a specific form of loneliness. Napoleon thought faster, saw further, and processed more complexity than almost anyone around him. And that gap, between what he could see and what others could follow, became, over time, a prison. He stopped listening because he was usually right. He stopped consulting because consultation felt slow. He stopped updating his models because his models had been correct so many times before. Psychologists call this the curse of competence, when past success makes a person immune to present information. The same cognitive capacity that let Napoleon see what others couldn't eventually made him unable to see what everyone else could. That Russia was too vast, that the coalition would not break, that he had run out of the one resource his system required, new territory to conquer. His genius didn't protect him from his psychology. It made his psychology invisible to him until it was too late. So here's what Napoleon's psychological profile actually tells us. Not that he was simply a tyrant who deserved his fate, but that he was a genuinely extraordinary human being, whose psychological architecture made it impossible for him to use his gifts without eventually being consumed by them. The compensatory narcissism that drove him to prove himself. The control compulsion that made him irreplaceable and exhausted. The hubris syndrome that eliminated feedback exactly when he needed it most. The achievement trap that made peace feel like annihilation. And the isolation of genius that turned his greatest strength into his blind spot. Here's the hard truth about Napoleon. He didn't fail because he wasn't good enough. He failed because he was too good for too long, with no psychological infrastructure to survive it. Genius without self-awareness is not a gift. It is a mechanism for building something magnificent and then burning it down.